Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And as some of you may know, the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art is lucky enough to have the world's largest collection of works by Grant Wood. And perhaps the most important piece in that collection, if you will, is the fact that the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art owns and operates the Grant Wood Studio, which is a short 3 blocks away from the main building. It is open to the public on Saturdays and Sundays from the beginning of April through the end of December from noon until 4. And if you have not had the opportunity to visit the Grant Wood Studio, I certainly encourage you to do so. Now is a wonderful time to come and see where Grant Wood lived and worked from 1924 to 1935 and created some of his most important works of art. That is going to be the topic of today's presentation. And today's talk will be somewhat of a reprise of a paper that I was invited to give in the fall of 2019 at a conference on historic artist homes and studios that was being held in London. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about that particular conference before I read my paper and share the PowerPoint that I created to go with it. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. So here we go. All right. Just a second. Here we go. There we are. And can everyone see that? See my screen? Do a nod or a thumbs up? Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay. So the conference was entitled Homework, and it focused specifically on artist studios homes, both in Britain and in the United States. And it was held over 2 days on September 30th and October 1st of 2019. It was organized by the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art, along with the Henry Moore Foundation just outside of London, and was co-sponsored by the Historic Artist Homes and Studios, which we refer to as HAAS here, and was underwritten with support from the Terra Foundation for American Art. Historic Artists and Homes organization is an organization that was originated in 1999, and in the year 2000 they invited 20 organizations to kind of be that core group of historic artist homes, to be kind of that founding group, and it has now expanded. There are now I believe 48 historic artist homes that are part of this consortium in the United States. I am sharing with you a map right now of those historic artist homes and studios throughout the United States. You can see that there's quite a cluster of them on the East Coast. But you can see we are spread across the United States, and I hope that you can see, there we are, the Grant Wood Studio here in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. They have a wonderful website. The Historic Artist Homes and Studios organization is a wonderful website. I invite you to take a look at it. It does highlight each of these 48 museum studios. And tells you a little bit about them. Recently, also, the executive director of the Historic Artists and Home Studio group, Valerie Balent, is the author of a new book. I'm going to hold it up. I don't know if you can see it. A tiny book. It is, of course, available at the Grant Wood Studio and at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art store, called A Guide to Historic Artists' Homes and Studios. And it highlights each of these organizations in the United States. As I said, they were one of the co-sponsors of the conference in London, but there is a counterpart to the American Historic Artist Homes and Studios group. It is called the Artists Studio Museum Network, and that really kind of encompasses the remainder of the world. And they represent some 125 artists' homes and studios in 21 different countries. You can see that they tend to be very much clustered in Europe, although there are artists' homes in Iceland, in New Zealand, and in China. But here I show you an expanded version of the European map that shows kind of where they are clustered. A number of them, of course, are in Britain, and a number of those participants were at the conference as well. But you can see it really is the whole of Europe, including several in Moscow as well. And so it is a counterpart to the American Historic Artists' Homes and Studios group. The homework conference was not just a catch-all, it was not a free-for-all, it was very, very specific. There were three major themes that they wanted all submissions to sort of fall underneath. One was to investigate the research landscape, one was the artistic landscape, and one was the physical landscape. I chose to submit a paper under the physical landscape on Grant Wood, which really looked, the Grant Wood Studio, which really looked at the question of authenticity. And so here, get this over here. You can see these are some of the attributes that some of the issues that they wanted the presenter to deal with when they approached the question of authenticity. You know, what is authenticity in these sites for the public? What determines an authentic experience? What challenges are there with regards to presenting original materials to an audience, and at the same time preserving the original artifacts from deterioration, and any other issues relating to the use of original material versus technology, facsimiles, and other tools. So these were some of the guiding principles that they wanted each presenter to incorporate in their talk. 13 of us were invited to speak at this conference, about half from the United States, half from Britain, and there were a wide variety of organizations that were represented. And here's a listing of the different artists' homes and studios that were presenting at the conference. And you can see there the Grant Wood Studio in the order in which they presented. You can see that the Grant Wood Studio is listed there in the second column. Now, I'm going to read to you the paper and share with you the PowerPoint. Now, the paper has a very strict requirement. In addition to adhering to one of the three themes of the conference, it also needed to be 15 minutes or less. It was a very hard stop. My paper came in at 14 minutes and 58 seconds. And that was when I was reading it really, really quickly. So I'm going to slow down a little bit here and read the paper at a much more appropriate pace. So we may actually go over the 15 minutes here, but I wanted to take my time with it a little bit. When I first wrote the paper, it was about 30 minutes. So it was a matter of trimming until I could trim no more, until I met the 15-minute threshold and got that sort of in place. So here we go. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you about the Grant Wood Studio. Before I begin, I would like to take just a moment to thank both the Paul Mellon Center and the Henry Moore Foundation for hosting this convocation, and a special thanks to the Terra Foundation for American Art for providing the assistance that enabled me to attend this conference. The Grant Wood Studio was never meant to be a studio at all. It is, at its very core, a hayloft. This rather compact 975 square foot space with its sloping ceiling was nothing more than the second story of a carriage barn. It was a brick and wood structure built to accompany a Georgian Revival style mansion constructed in the mid to late 1890s by George Bruce Douglas Jr. George Douglas, along with his brother Walter, were the co-founders of Douglas Starch Works, an important early company in Cedar Rapids, which by 1914 was the largest starch works company in the world. George Douglas Jr. and his family lived in the home until 1906, when they arranged a rather unprecedented house swap with Carolyn Sinclair, widow of Thomas Sinclair, founder of the Sinclair meatpacking plant. Mrs. Sinclair felt that her home, an 1886 brick Victorian on the then outskirts of Cedar Rapids, was too large for her family, and the Douglases, in turn, wanted more property in order to plant formal gardens. It was during Mrs. Sinclair's time in the Georgian mansion that she decided to have the carriage house moved about 40 feet away from the main house. In 1917, 11 years after the house swap, Mrs. Sinclair passed away, and the property was occupied by her son, who in turn sold it in 1923 to John B. Turner, a local mortuary owner whose nearby funeral home had grown too small for his business. John B. Turner and his son David employed a friend of his son's, one Grant Wood, to help convert the mansion into a funeral home. The Turners added a large wing to the one side of the mansion, and Wood designed, among other things, the rose-colored bay window in front of which the bodies were laid. It was John B. Turner and his son David who invited Grant Wood to use the hayloft as a potential studio, for they no longer needed the space for hay as their hearses were all motorized by this period. This was a critical moment for Grant Wood. The hayloft reminded him of the garret he had occupied with his good friend Marvin Cohn on their trip to Paris in summer of 1920. No sooner had he stepped foot inside the hayloft than he started to think that, with a little clever remodeling, he could transform this space to be not only a studio, but also a place to live. Drawing upon his arts and crafts background, that's exactly what he did. And in 1925, he moved in full time, bringing along his aging mother and frequently housing his sister as well. Not having to pay rent or a mortgage allowed Wood to give up his teaching position at McKinley Junior High School and to paint full time. Wood lived and worked in the Grant Wood studio until 1935, when he moved to Iowa City to assume a teaching position at the University of Iowa. It was in this studio that Wood created some of his most famous and iconic paintings, including American Gothic. The Cedar Rapids Museum of Art received the Grant Wood Studio in 2002 as a gift from the Lingy family. They own and operate Cedar Memorial, the successors to Turner Mortuary. However, as they say, there are no free puppies. Since that time, the studio has witnessed two major restoration projects. First, to shore up the structure and to convert the first floor garage into a visitor center. And then, several years later, a second project to restore and preserve the exterior envelope of the structure, removing all of the lead-based paint, restoring the original windows, and securing the cupola. Neither project was inexpensive, but with the help of various donors, foundations, and historic preservation grants, we were able to accomplish this vitally important structural work, which totaled approximately $1 million. Despite all of this work, however, the interior of the studio itself remained relatively unchanged. Careful not to make any significant changes to the studio proper until we determined all of the interior work that needs to be done, we have had several analyses conducted of the various paint layers and later modifications. For the studio was more or less continuously occupied by tenants from the time Wood left in 1935 until as recently as 2000. What does this mean for our visitors? How do we provide an authentic experience in a relatively empty space? Our efforts to provide an authentic experience are perhaps best demonstrated by walking you through a visit to the Grant Wood studio. After parking in our lot or walking the 3 short blocks from the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, the visitor is asked to enter the visitor center first. Here, a staff member greets the visitor and explains that tours of the studio are by docent guide only, and they are welcome to watch the introductory 30-minute film on the life of Grant Wood or view some of the other materials available in the visitor center for their perusal. The film screened, Grant Wood something we produced for our major 2005 exhibition on the work of Grant Wood, celebrating the acquisition and opening of the Grant Wood studio. It provides a nice overview of the life of Grant Wood and introduces viewers to some of his better-known works, as well as many works to which the docents will speak more directly in their guided tours. It also allows the docent to concentrate less on the biography of Grant Wood and more on the work he produced while in the studio. At the conclusion of the film, the docent, who has just finished up his or her previous half-hour tour upstairs, appears and gathers up the next group. This requires leaving the visitor center, at which time the docent discusses the nearby Turner Mortuary and Wood's role at that place. Rounding the corner, the visitors proceed up the modern stairs and stop at the top to look at Wood's unique door. The door, a facsimile of the original now housed in the nearby Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, was fashioned from a coffin lid, readily available from the mortuary next door, in which Wood crafted a dial to inform prospective visitors whether he was in or out, and if the latter, when he was returning. It also let visitors know if he was having a party, out o' town, or even taking a bath. Upon passing through the door, the visitor is required to navigate a half story of narrow stairs with a modern-day railing to assist. For many years, people used the more rustic chain link railing opposite until the faux black end plates began to deteriorate. They are not forged of wrought iron as they appear, but rather are painted cardboard, saving this frugal artist some expense. At the top of the stairs, the visitor enters a single large space, which served as living, eating, working, and sleeping quarters for Grant Wood, his mother Hattie, and on occasion his sister Nan Wood Graham. The volunteer docents share several of Wood's modifications that transformed this hayloft into a home and studio for 11 years. These include the installation of a fireplace to warm the space. The hood is a metal bushel basket turned upside down. Originally, they heated their tea on the hood. To the right is the so-called hot dog stand, a drop-down eating space for Wood and his mother with a pass-through from the kitchen. Further right, a sitting area, although the table is a later addition. Opposite is the sleeping area, where single beds would be tucked under the eave and shielded from view by curtains during the daytime. The storage cabinets above could house not only painting supplies, but also clothing and other household goods. The dormer that Wood created by punching through the roof, allowing in western light and painting and providing room for a desk. Painting storage racks can be found to either side of the dormer. These slide in and out to conceal and reveal the works that Wood was painting. These possess original wrought iron pulls designed by Wood, as well as a faux studded leather surface that Wood fabricated by using simple upholstery tacks and fabric, which he then painted. Original wrought iron light fixtures designed by Grant Wood, and a modern easel where his original easel stood. The telephone stand on two levels, since one of them liked to stand when talking while the other liked to sit. The north windows, where hay used to come in from the alley. A window box seat covers the radiator that was installed during Wood's time. At some point during his occupation of the space, Wood punched through the roof on the northeast corner, creating a separate sleeping room for his mother. The large arched opening is able to be closed off by a hinged metal divider held in place by a clasp. Between the main room and Hattie's new room was a radiator to heat both rooms, with a stylized floral grill on the living room side of the radiator. Hattie's room was heavily modified after Wood moved out, and thus now houses a couple of display cases holding a few artifacts, mostly metalwork he designed and majolica he collected. Across from the entrance into Hattie's room is the bathroom, replete with built-ins and a sunken tub. This tub neatly fills the hole where the original internal ladder to the loft was and where the hay would be dropped down to feed the horses. It also allowed for both a bath and a shower in a rather confined and sloped space, thus serving both occupants, one of whom preferred to take baths while the other showers. The last small room is the kitchen, which has been heavily modified and is in a state of disrepair. There was no stove during Wood's time, only a hot plate, but a small stove was inserted by a subsequent tenant. In addition, the more modern refrigerator has been removed since Wood only had a modest icebox. The docent giving the tour has a few props to assist during the visit. First and foremost, we are fortunate to have several black and white photos of the space as it looked when Wood lived there. These are used and shared by the docent to help make the space come alive for the visitor. These historic photographs aid the visitor's experience greatly. They demonstrate how Wood used the space, and the visitor can compare how the space was then and how it appears now. And there are occasional details in the photographs that do not appear today, such as the curtains that used to hang separating the sleeping area from the rest of the room. Not only would these draperies allow for cutting down on drafts and more efficient heating of the sleeping area, they also served as stage curtains for the small theatrical productions Wood and his friends would write and perform in the studio, thus establishing the first community theater in Cedar Rapids, today known as Theater Cedar Rapids. In addition to the historic photos, the docents may also use reproductions of a few of the works that Wood created while he lived in the studio. We had these made to their exact dimensions on masonite, a particle board frequently used by Wood and used with these same pieces. These reproductions include Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Daughters of the Revolution, Young Corn, Woman with Plants, which is a portrait of his mother, and of course, American Gothic. These 5 works represent a nice cross-section of the works he created while living and working at the studio. Each tells a story, and the docent is prepared to share that story. For example, the painting Daughters of the Revolution is an intentional parody of the organization known as Daughters of the American Revolution, who refused to dedicate the large stained glass window he had designed for the Veterans Memorial Building because Wood had the window fabricated in Munich simply because there were no craftsmen in the United States up to the task. It was, at the time, the largest stained glass window in the United States. The Daughters of the American Revolution, however, felt it was inappropriate to use German workers so recently after the First World War, even though this was 1928-29, a full 10 years after the end of the Great War. In his own commentary on the situation, Wood painted a trio of these rather prissy women, one daintily holding her cup, seated before a print of the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. The irony here, of course, is that the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, one of the most iconic images in America, was not American at all. It was painted by Emanuel Leutze, a German-American painter who painted the work in Germany, using American tourists and art students as models. And the river is not, in all likelihood, the Delaware, but rather the Rhine. The history and humor of the painting is shared with the visitor by way of the docent. Obviously, the reproduction is not authentic, but the story is. Then, of course, there is the obvious. The docent can encourage the visitor to come to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. Located only 3 walkable blocks away, the CRMA houses the world's largest collection of works by Grant Wood, a portion of which is always on view. While our holdings of Wood's work number almost 300 pieces, some 60% of them are works on paper and unable to be on perpetual view. However, we do have a one gallery exhibition that traces the trajectory of Wood's career, from his earlier impressionistic works through his works for hire to his mature work, ending with Spring in the Country, completed shortly before his death from pancreatic cancer, one day shy of his 51st birthday. So what are our goals for the future of the Grant Wood Studio? At one time, we had hoped that we might be able to populate the studio much as it was in Wood's day, and to do away with docent-led tours, thus relieving us of the challenges of finding volunteer docents to give of their time and talents week after week. However, while we still hope to do the former, we are no longer considering the elimination of the docent altogether. For it is the docent that truly helps to make the space come alive. While it might be easy enough to find original furnishings or reproductions of them, the studio would simply be a place full of objects, without any sort of interpretation. A docent, whether giving a formal tour or simply in the space to answer questions, is critical to the storytelling world we find ourselves in today. And storytelling is what Grant Wood was all about. Each of his works tells a different story, filled with a narrative all their own. And their place in his life is a part of that story as well. The actual works of art can be found nearby, thus offering an authentic experience of the art. But the story of his life is what happened in the studio proper, and that continues to be the authentic story that we tell. Stop sharing here. And I am more than happy to take questions about the presentation or about the Grant Wood Studio. As you can see, it was a relatively short presentation by design, but I'm sure there might be other questions that individuals may have. So if you would like to unmute yourselves and ask questions, I'd be happy to tackle them. Jean, yes.
Upon visiting the studio, there was overalls that he had lacquered to the wall so he could use it for tools. Could you speak to that?
Well, in the hot dog stand, that area, that dining area, he did have a 4-panel door system there. 3 kind of open to one side and 1 opens to the other. Those were covered with denim material that he then painted. Those were not used for tools per se, but they were used to create a texture on those doors. Those are in the possession of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and it is our hope that someday when we enter kind of a phase 3 of restoration, where we tackle the interior of the studio itself, that we will be able to reinstate those, because it's our opinion that they do no good sitting in storage. But they would really add something to the experience of the studio themselves. He did use other fabrics throughout the studio. As I mentioned, where he stored his paintings, those you can pull those doors out. You can see that they are also covered in fabric, and then he used tacks, just thumbtacks, simple thumbtacks, that he then painted. It made it look like it was a studded leather. And that fabric is not denim per se; it is some other fabric, but it made it look like it was actually leather. So I don't know specifically if I don't remember any stories specifically of using overalls for holding his tools, but he certainly wore overalls while he worked in the studio, and I think that part of the reason for that was that, number one, it was a sort of ubiquitous work outfit. I mean, you would use overalls on the farm, but you would also use overalls in factories. And it was a great way for him to put his brushes and other things that he needed while painting. He could wear those. And so it was very much a work uniform for him.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
In the last painting, there was a white schoolhouse. Do you know where that's located?
Oh, I I think that is the Antioch Schoolhouse, if memory serves me, but don't quote me on that because I haven't thought about that painting in a while. But I believe that it is, and it's sort of a reference, into his own sort of one-room schoolhouse that he grew up in when he was in Anamosa. That he recalled from childhood. He moved to Cedar Rapids at the age of 10. But he remembered that one-room schoolhouse very well. So I think it's also very much about his own memory of his original schoolhouse.
Did he go to school also in Stone City?
No, he went to school in Anamosa.
Okay.
But which is very near Stone City. I think there was, they were very close to each other, but I don't believe he went to school in Stone City. But again, don't quote me on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome. Other
you have any-
questions?
I think that his creativity of how he made the studio space so workable and livable is just amazing. I mean, he was so clever beyond his painting skills, which just is very impressive.
I absolutely agree. I mean, keep in mind that he really started out as a metal worker initially. I mean, that's what he had gone to Minneapolis to study, and that's where he started, eventually becoming a painter and printmaker and so forth. But and he comes out of that arts and crafts tradition, which was, very much about making the environment, the living environment, as beautiful as possible, to kind of live with art all around you. And I think that he took that to heart. And so as he saw that hayloft, I think he realized that with cleverness, and he was absolutely a clever individual, he could modify that space to be both a living and working a space for himself and his mother, and sometimes his sister as well. And I think any of you that have had the good fortune to visit the Grant Wood studio would agree that he made great use of every possible square inch of that space. And really made it very, very functional. I mean, when we take groups through the studio, one of the things I like to mention is, he was really very, very forward thinking. We talk about living tiny these days, and Grant Wood was already doing it. Part of it was, out of sort of necessity, trying to make the most out of that 975 square foot space, which has to incorporate those sloping ceilings as well. But he really was sort of I think in many ways, an innovator in making the most out of that space. And I think that for anyone that's visiting that studio, with the exception of the kitchen, which has been so heavily modified, they will see his creativity, his ingenuity, his ever exploring, I think, mind. And that's the thing that I like people to take away from any visit to the museum or the studio, is that he was constantly exploring, constantly pushing himself as an artist, as a creative, pushing himself to new heights. And I think the studio is a testament to what he was able to do with a relatively confined space.
I was a little bit late to the talk here, but how does one become a docent as far as giving tours and so forth?
Well, we would love, if any of you are interested in being a docent, if you would reach out to our museum educator, Erin Thomas, and you can sign up right on our website. And there's training involved, but we love to grow our docent ranks. The more, the merrier. It is a wonderful place to give a tour of. I mean, both the museum, but especially the Grant Wood studio, and the docent is vital in making the studio come alive for individuals. So, yeah, if you are at all interested, as I mentioned, the studio is open to the public on weekends from April through December, from noon to 4. We generally like to, at the studio, have docents work 2-hour shifts, either 12 to 2 or 2 to 4 on Saturday or on Sunday, and to kind of share the wealth, as it were, with all of our docents. And I can tell you, the docents find the experience to be extremely rewarding. Because certainly there are a number of people who come to the Grant Wood Studio who are from the local area, but many of our visitors come from all over the country and internationally as well. And this is probably their only time to visit the studio. And they're so appreciative. They love being able to be in the studio and see where Grant Wood lived and worked. And I think that they all walk away from the experience really transformed by having visited the studio. Part of that is the space, but an equal part of that is the docent who makes that space come alive.
Yes, a comment about your talk. You've widened our world, and we will look forward to visiting artists' homes when we travel. We have seen a few in the past, but this has led us to realize that there are more than we knew about. So thank you.
Oh, you are most welcome, and thank you for bringing it up. I mean, we're proud to be part of the Historic Artists and Studios group, Artist Homes and Studios group, but we're one of, right now, 48, and there's many others that are out there. There is strict criteria to joining, and so you have to apply as a historic site. You have to apply to this organization and meet rigorous standards. And so I imagine that the Historic Artists and Home Studio Group will continue to grow. Like I said, right now it's 48 and counting. And you can find them all currently on their wonderful website, as well as, a wonderful sort of series of images of each of them. And if you ever find yourself in the New England area, you'll find many historic artists and homes, historic artist homes and studios, excuse me, for you to visit. And I'm happy to say that I certainly have not visited all 48 of them myself, but I have had the good fortune to visit several of them. And each of them offers a very different experience and different insights into the world of those artists who lived and worked there.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
Are there any written recollections from Grant Wood about having lived and worked in the studio?
Not that I have seen. He did start to write an autobiography, but he didn't get very far in his life. And I have not seen anything written specifically about his time in the studio. There are snippets of things here and there, but nothing that I can recall seeing.
Thanks.
Good question. So any of you that are out there that are artists, write things down. Write things down. We're going to want to see those years and years from now. Trust me, we will. But I know most artists speak through their works, but it's nice to have written things down too. So for all of us subsequent researchers. And while I still have you all, before you click off, I want to mention that we do have another program coming up on Sunday. On Sunday, we are continuing our series of Grant Wood presentations outside of the Art Bites rubric. And we are going to do a screening of 1142. 1142 references 1142 East Court Street in Iowa City, which is currently the home of Jim Hayes. And it is the home that Grant Wood moved to when he left the studio. So if you're interested in where Grant Wood lived and worked, the natural sort of next step is to join us on Sunday at 2 o'clock. We will screen by Zoom this 1 hour documentary of the people who lived in 1142 East Court Street. And Jim is the narrator of that documentary. And he talks many, many times throughout the documentary about Grant Wood. And then at the conclusion of that screening, which, as I said, is about an hour, Jim will join us at the Zoom to answer any of the individual questions that you might have about 1142. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to get inside that home. If you have not had the good fortune to be inside that home, to be inside that home. And I think it's a natural sort of follow-on to looking inside the Grant Wood studio, where he was from 1924 to 1935, to looking at 1142, where he lived from 1935 until his death in 1942. And so I think it's a wonderful documentary. I don't think it has been screened as widely as it should be. So we're going to try and remedy that a little bit by screening it via Zoom. So I hope that you are able to join us this Sunday at 2 o'clock, from 2 to 3:30. The screening will be from 2 to 3, and then Jim will join us at 3 to answer any questions you may have from 3 to 3:30.
A comment?
Yes.
I believe I've been told, or I have read, that Grant Wood also did some of his work in that house when he lived there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. It was a home and studio as well. Mm-hmm. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this very, very brief overview of the Grant Wood studio, and please do consider coming and visiting the studio if you haven't been in a while. Like I said, it is open on the weekends. Right now, we also have a number of Grant Wood exhibitions on view at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and we are in the midst of our free summer program, so there are no admission charges either at the studio or at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. It would make a wonderful stop to see the 4 separate exhibitions that we have on Grant Wood right now at the museum, and take in the studio all in the same visit. So look forward to welcoming you here at the museum or at the Grant Wood studio. And thanks for joining us today.